At my son's wedding dinner, my husband of 32 years stood up, looked me dead in the eye, and announced, "This is the end for us, Evelyn. I've found someone new." His girlfriend, his secretary, Vanessa, sat directly across from me at our family table, wearing a smug smile like she just won the lottery. The entire reception hall went silent. Every fork stopped midair. Every conversation died. My own family stared at me like I was a wounded animal they didn't know how to help. But instead of breaking down, instead of screaming or throwing my wine in his face like everyone expected, I leaned forward, looked my husband straight in the eye, and said with the calmest voice I could muster, "Well, Harold, thanks for the heads up." Then I reached into my purse, pulled out a manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward him. "Here's a little something for you to read later." Before he could even touch that envelope, I stood up, smoothed down my emerald green dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this beautiful day, kissed my son Marcus on the forehead, and walked out of that reception hall with my head held high. Behind me, I heard Harold tearing open the envelope. Then came the sound that still gives me chills to this day. A scream so loud, so full of rage and panic that it echoed through that entire banquet hall. I want to pause here because I'm so grateful you're listening to my story. If you're watching this, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I need to know this story of revenge is reaching people who understand betrayal. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale has traveled, because what happened next changed everything. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of what should have been the happiest day of my life. It was supposed to be perfect. Marcus's wedding day, my baby boy, 28 years old, marrying the love of his life, Lisa, in a small ceremony at the historic Lakeside Estate. I'd spent months planning every detail with Lisa, from the lavender orchids to the 3-course dinner. The venue was intimate, just 40 guests, all family and close friends, gathered in the elegant dining room with its crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. I was sitting at the head table, right where the mother of the groom should be. To my left sat Marcus and Lisa, glowing with newlywed happiness. To my right should have been my husband, Harold, but he'd mysteriously stepped away just as the salad course was being served. I remember thinking it was odd. Harold never missed a meal, especially not when it was being paid for. The room buzzed with warmth and laughter. Uncle Robert was telling his famous hunting stories to the kids' table. My sister Helen was already tearing up during the toasts, and we hadn't even gotten to the main course yet. Lisa's parents were beaming, taking pictures of everything. This was exactly what I dreamed of for my son, surrounded by love, starting his new life with all of us there to celebrate. Then I saw her, Vanessa Carter, Harold's 28-year-old secretary, the same age as my son, for God's sakes, sliding into the empty chair directly across from me. She was wearing a crimson dress that cost more than most people's rent, her auburn hair perfectly styled, sapphire earrings catching the light. She looked like she owned the place. My stomach dropped. What was she doing here? Harold had never mentioned inviting her. Vanessa caught my eye and gave me this little wave, like we were old friends meeting for lunch. The audacity of it made my hands shake. Before I could process what was happening, Harold reappeared, walking back to our table with a confidence I hadn't seen in him in months. He was wearing his best navy suit, the one I'd pressed for him that morning, and there was something different about his posture, like he was about to give a presentation he'd been rehearsing.
He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind his chair, picked up his champagne glass, and tapped it with his fork. The gentle chiming sound cut through all the conversations. "Excuse me, everyone," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I have an announcement to make." The entire reception fell silent. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward our table. Marcus and Lisa looked confused but smiled expectantly. Maybe Dad was about to give a surprise toast. I felt ice forming in my veins. 32 years is a long time, Harold began, looking directly at me, long enough to know when something has run its course. The words hit me like physical blows. My son Marcus's face went from confusion to horror in real time. Lisa grabbed his hand. Helen dropped her fork with a clatter that seemed to echo forever. Evelyn, Harold continued, his voice steady and rehearsed, this is the end for us. I've found someone new. He gestured toward Vanessa, who actually had the nerve to lift her champagne glass in a little toast. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Somewhere in the distance, a server dropped a tray. Marcus started to stand up, his face flushed with rage. But I held up my hand to stop him. Because in that moment, sitting there in front of my family, my friends, my son's new wife and her parents, I realized something profound. Harold had just given me the greatest gift of my life. He'd shown everyone exactly who he really was. For 32 years, I put everyone else first. Let me tell you what that really means. Because when people hear about my story, they always ask the same question. How did you not see this coming? The truth is, I saw everything. I just chose to believe in the man I married instead of the man he was becoming. When Harold and I met in 1991, I was 26 years old and running a small bakery out of my apartment kitchen. Evelyn's Elegance. I called it comfort desserts with a gourmet twist. My grandmother's apple pie recipe elevated with cinnamon infusion and caramel drizzle. Scones that people drove across town for. Lemon bars that made grown men weep. I had 12 regular clients and dreams of opening my own patisserie. Harold was this charming sales manager who hired me to cater his office holiday party. He swept me off my feet with talk about building a life together, having children, creating something beautiful. 6 months later, he proposed with a modest ring and a promise that we'd chase our dreams together. The first sacrifice came during our engagement. Harold's company offered him a promotion that required us to move 3 hours away to a bigger city. It's temporary, he assured me, his hands cupping my face the way they used to when he wanted me to trust him completely. Just a few years to get established. Then we'll move back and you can restart your business. I believed him because I loved him. I sold my baking equipment, said goodbye to my clients, and followed him to a city where I knew nobody. The patisserie dream got packed away in boxes along with my grandmother's rolling pins. The second sacrifice came when Marcus was born 2 years later. Suddenly, Harold's career became even more important because we had a family to think about. He worked longer hours while I stayed home with our beautiful baby boy, pouring all my love and creativity into being the perfect mother. I told myself I'd restart the bakery when Marcus started school, but when Marcus turned 5, Harold's company restructured, he took a pay cut, and suddenly my hobby wasn't practical anymore. We need stability, Evelyn, he'd say, whenever I brought up my business dreams. Marcus needs his college fund. We need the house payment covered. Maybe when things settle down. Things never settled down. There was always another reason, another excuse, another financial goal that took priority over my dreams. So, I got a job at Premier Bank where my attention to detail and people skills made me indispensable. I processed mortgages, managed accounts, and learned every trick in the book about tracking money and uncovering financial secrets. Those skills would later save my life. But at the time, they just made me the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who kept everything running smoothly. For 32 years, I supported every single one of Harold's career moves. When he wanted to switch companies, I helped him polish his resume. When he needed to schmooze potential clients, I planned dinner parties that impressed everyone.
When he decided to start his own consulting firm 10 years ago, I co-signed the business loan with my pristine credit and worked overtime at the bank to cover our personal expenses while his business got off the ground. I never complained. Not really. I told myself that this was what good wives did. They supported their husbands. They put family first. They waited for their turn. I convinced myself that Harold appreciated my sacrifices, that he saw how much I gave up for him and Marcus. When Marcus graduated high school as valedictorian, I felt proud that my sacrifices had contributed to raising such an amazing young man. When he got into college on a full scholarship, I told myself all those years of putting his needs first had been worth it.
When Harold's business finally became profitable enough that we could afford luxuries again, I thought maybe finally it was my turn. I was 55 years old when I first brought up restarting my bakery. Now that Marcus has graduated college and your business is stable, I said over dinner one night, I've been thinking about getting back into baking professionally. Harold barely looked up from his phone. "That's nice, honey," he said with that dismissive tone he'd perfected over the years. "Business expenses, honey," he said with that dismissive tone he'd perfected over the years. "Client entertainment, networking events. Vanessa handles all the paperwork for reimbursements." Vanessa again. Always Vanessa these days. But why separate card? I pressed, my voice steadier than I felt. Why not use our business account? "Tax purposes," he replied smoothly. "Our accountant suggested it." "Don't worry about it, honey. You handle the home finances. I handle the business stuff." That should have been the end of it. The old me would have accepted his explanation and gone back to trusting blindly. But 30 years at the bank had taught me that financial secrets always tell the truth. And this statement was screaming lies. So I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I noticed how Harold's phone was always face down now, how he'd step outside to take certain calls, how he'd developed a sudden interest in working late on Fridays and weekends. I watched him shower longer, use cologne on random Tuesday mornings, and spend 20 minutes styling his hair for client meetings. The second discovery came 3 weeks later, when I was dropping off lunch at his office, a surprise visit with his favorite sandwich from the deli down the street. Vanessa wasn't at her desk, and I could hear laughter coming from Harold's office. Female laughter. Intimate laughter. I stood in that reception area for 5 minutes, listening to my husband's voice mixing with hers in a way that made my stomach turn inside out. They weren't discussing consulting contracts. They were discussing weekend plans, inside jokes, private moments that had nothing to do with business. When they finally emerged from his office, Vanessa's lipstick was smudged and Harold's tie was crooked. They both froze when they saw me standing there, holding his sandwich like some pathetic wife playing delivery service. "Evelyn!" Harold's voice was too bright, too surprised. "What brings you here?" "Brought your lunch," I managed, sending a bag on Vanessa's desk. "Thought you might be hungry." Vanessa smoothed her skirt and smiled at me with pure venom disguised as sweetness. "That's so thoughtful," she purred. "Harold's lucky to have someone who takes such good care of him." The way she said "takes care of him" made it clear that my job was menial, temporary, easily replaceable. I smiled back and left without another word. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I started documenting everything. Every late night, every unexplained absence, every time he claimed to be working but his office lights were off when I drove by. I used my lunch breaks to follow him sometimes, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. Harold and Vanessa holding hands in restaurant booths across town, kissing in his car in empty parking lots, shopping together at jewelry stores where he'd never taken me, not even for our anniversary. But the worst discovery was yet to come. 2 months before the wedding, I was balancing our joint checking account when I noticed irregular transfers, small amounts, 500 here, 800 there, moving out of our savings into an account I didn't recognize. The reference numbers led me down a rabbit hole that made my blood run cold. Using my access at the bank, I traced those transfers to a secret account Harold had opened 18 months earlier, an account with both his name and Vanessa's name on it, an account that contained over $40,000 of our money he'd been systematically stealing from our retirement savings to fund his affair. Jewelry purchases for Vanessa, weekend getaways to lakeside resorts, down payment on an apartment lease in her name, expensive dinners, designer clothes, spa treatments.
He was literally paying for his new life with the money I'd helped save for old age. The paper trail painted a picture so clear it left no room for doubt. This wasn't some midlife crisis or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated betrayal, planned and executed over months while I slept next to him every night, trusting him with my whole heart. I printed every statement, photographed every receipt, documented every lie. My bank training had taught me that financial evidence doesn't lie the way people do. Numbers tell stories that can't be denied or explained away. Sitting in my car outside that bank, holding a manila folder full of proof that my marriage was a fraud, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just heartbreak or anger, but a cold, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. Harold thought he was smart, covering his tracks with separate accounts and secret credit cards,
But he'd forgotten one crucial detail. He was stealing from a woman who spent 30 years learning how to follow money trails and uncover financial deception. He'd just given me all the ammunition I needed to destroy him. Instead of confronting him directly, I decided to let him hang himself with his own rope. You see, my first instinct was to burst into his office and throw those bank statements in his face, to scream and cry and make him feel as devastated as I did. But 30 years of marriage had taught me something valuable about my husband. Harold always underestimated me. He saw me as the quiet, dependable wife who'd never cause a scene, never fight back, never do anything that might embarrass him publicly. And for the first time in our marriage, I realized his assumptions about me could become his greatest weakness. Sitting in my car that day, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I wasn't going to hand him the perfect excuse to paint me as the hysterical, vindictive ex-wife who couldn't handle being replaced by a younger woman. Instead, I was going to use every advantage I had against him. And the beautiful irony was that Harold himself had given me the most powerful weapon of all, the prenuptial agreement. I'd almost forgotten about it until I was reorganizing our file cabinet, looking for the deed to our house. There it was, filed between our insurance policies and Marcus's birth certificate. 32 pages of legal protection that Harold had insisted on after his first marriage ended badly. I'm not going through that financial nightmare again, he told me during our engagement, his first wife's expensive divorce still fresh in his memory. This protects both of us, Evelyn. It's just smart planning. I'd signed it without really reading it, trusting him completely, believing that our love would last forever and those legal documents would never matter. Young love makes you do foolish things like sign contracts you don't understand. But now, staring at those yellowed pages, I needed to know exactly what I'd agreed to 32 years ago. That's when I called Laura Bennett. Laura had been my college roommate, the smartest woman I knew who'd gone on to become a family law attorney specializing in high-asset divorces. We'd stayed in touch over the years, meeting for lunch whenever her schedule allowed, sharing stories about our kids and our marriages. "Evelyn?" Laura's voice was surprised when she answered my call. "This is unexpected. How are you doing?" "I need legal advice," I said without preamble, "and I need absolute confidentiality." The silence stretched for several seconds. Laura was sharp enough to understand that this wasn't a casual call about updating our wills. "Come to my office tomorrow," she said finally. "Bring whatever documents you have." The next morning, I sat across from Laura in her downtown law office, watching her face change as she read through my prenuptial agreement. Her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine surprise to something that looked almost like admiration. "Evelyn," she said finally, setting the papers down and leaning back in her chair, "do you understand what you have here? A prenup that protects his assets?" I replied, unsure why she looked so pleased. "Much more than that," Laura said, flipping to page 23 and pointing to a specific clause. "This is a faithfulness provision. Your husband insisted on including language that voids most of the asset protection if either party commits adultery during the marriage." My heart stopped completely. "What does that mean?" "It means," Laura continued, her voice growing more excited, "that if you can prove Harold has been unfaithful, this prenuptial agreement becomes worthless. All those protections he put in place to safeguard his business and investments, they disappear the moment he violated his marriage vows." The irony was so perfect, it almost made me laugh. Harold's paranoia about his first wife's betrayal had led him to create a legal trap for his own infidelity. "How much proof do I need?" I asked, thinking about the manila folder full of evidence sitting in my car. Laura smiled like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Bank records showing he used marital assets to fund an affair would be excellent. Photos of them together would be helpful. Any evidence of cohabitation or joint financial accounts would be devastating. I had all of that and more." "There's something else," Laura said, flipping through more pages. "Because you co-signed the business loan and worked unpaid for his company, you're entitled to compensation for your contributions. Combined with the adultery clause, you're looking at keeping the house, most of the investments, and potentially alimony." For the first time in months, I felt genuine hope spreading through my chest. "But here's the key," Laura continued. "You need to file first. Don't give him time to hide assets or prepare a defense. Strike quickly and decisively." That afternoon, I began preparing for war. I organized every piece of evidence, documented every stolen dollar, and started planning the most important performance of my life. Harold wanted to humiliate me at our son's wedding. He wanted to flaunt his affair in front of our family and friends. Perfect. Let him think he held all the cards. Let him believe he'd outmaneuvered this simple little wife who'd never caused him a moment of trouble. Because while he was planning his grand announcement, I was planning something far more devastating. I was going to let him destroy himself in front of everyone who mattered, and then I was going to hand him the legal consequences of his choices, wrapped up in a neat little envelope. The best part was that everything I was about to do to him was completely legal, completely justified, and completely his own fault. Harold had spent 32 years underestimating me. He was about to learn exactly how expensive that mistake would be. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence or planning my legal strategy. It was pretending to be the same naive, trusting wife Harold expected me to be. For 6 weeks leading up to Marcus's wedding, I had to perform the role of my life, the devoted spouse who suspected nothing, questioned nothing, and would never dream of fighting back. Every morning, I made Harold's coffee exactly the way he liked it, kissed him goodbye, and wished him well at work. Every evening, I asked about his day and listened to his lies about late meetings and difficult clients. When he claimed he'd be working weekends, I packed him lunch and told him not to work too hard. The performance required every ounce of self-control I possessed. When he came home smelling like Vanessa's perfume, I bit my tongue and said nothing. When he forgot our anniversary for the first time in 32 years, I pretended it didn't matter. When he started working out obsessively and buying new clothes, I complimented his dedication to staying healthy. Most challenging of all was acting surprised and grateful when he offered to pay for Marcus's wedding reception. "I know money's been tight with the wedding expenses," he said one evening, barely looking up from his phone.
"Why don't I cover the dinner? It's my son's big day." What he didn't know was that I'd already seen the credit card statements. He wasn't being generous. He was planning something. The reception was the perfect venue for maximum humiliation. A captive audience of family and friends who'd witness my public destruction. "That's so thoughtful," I replied, playing my part perfectly. "Marcus will be thrilled. Should I handle the arrangements?" "Actually," Harold said, and I caught the slight smile playing at his lips, "let me take care of this one. I want everything to be perfect." "Perfect? For what?" I wondered, but I nodded and smiled like the obedient wife he thought he'd married. While Harold planned his grand finale, I was orchestrating something far more devastating. Laura had filed my divorce papers that morning, but they wouldn't be served until after the wedding. I didn't want anything to spoil Marcus's day or tip off Harold before he'd fully committed to his public humiliation. The manila envelope became my constant companion. I carried it everywhere, sometimes touching it through my purse, just to remind myself that I held all the power. Inside were copies of the divorce papers, the adultery evidence, the bank statements showing his theft, and a detailed accounting of every asset he thought he'd protected with that prenuptial agreement. 3 days before the wedding, Harold made his final, fatal mistake. "Evelyn," he said over dinner, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate, "I need to tell you something about the reception." I looked up from my plate, channeling every ounce of innocent curiosity I could muster. "What about it?" "I've invited Vanessa," he said, watching my face carefully. "She's been such a huge help with the business, and I thought it would be nice to include her in the celebration." The audacity of it took my breath away. He was bringing his mistress to our son's wedding, setting the stage for maximum cruelty, and he wanted my permission first. The old Evelyn would have questioned it, maybe even objected. But the new Evelyn, the one who'd been planning her revenge for weeks, simply smiled. "Of course," I said. "That's very thoughtful. She's been working so hard." Harold's face showed a flicker of surprise, as if he expected more resistance, but then his expression settled into smug satisfaction. He thought he'd broken me down so completely that I wouldn't even fight for my own dignity. "Good," he said. "I knew you'd understand." That night, I finalized every detail of my plan. The envelope was prepared, the legal papers filed and ready, the evidence organized and documented.
I even practiced my response in the mirror, perfecting the calm, graceful demeanor that would throw everyone off balance. Because I'd realized something crucial about revenge. The sweetest kind comes not from losing your temper, but from maintaining perfect control while your enemy destroys himself. The morning of Marcus's wedding, I woke up feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. I put on my emerald green dress, the one that made me feel confident and powerful, and did my makeup with extra care. Today wasn't just my son's wedding day. It was the day I reclaimed my life. Harold was unusually cheerful as we got ready, humming while he shaved, taking extra time with his appearance. He thought today was his victory lap, the day he'd finally rid himself of the boring wife who'd served her purpose and could now be discarded for a newer model. At the reception, I watched him whisper something to Vanessa that made her laugh, probably discussing how easy this was going to be, how I'd never see it coming. I smiled and waved at them across the room, playing my part. Until the very last moment, when Harold stood up to make his announcement, when he looked at me with that mixture of pity and cruelty in his eyes, when he delivered his rehearsed speech about our marriage being over, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He thought he was about to destroy me. Instead, he just walked directly into the trap I'd spent 6 weeks preparing. Every word he spoke, every cruel revelation, every moment of public humiliation he'd inflicted on me in front of our family only made the contents of that envelope more devastating. Because while Harold had been planning a public execution, I'd been preparing a resurrection that would leave him screaming.
Why don't I cover the dinner? It's my son's big day. What he didn't know was that I'd already seen the credit card statements. He wasn't being generous. He was planning something. The reception was the perfect venue for maximum humiliation. A captive audience of family and friends who'd witness my public destruction. "That's so thoughtful," I replied, playing my part perfectly. "Marcus will be thrilled. Should I handle the arrangements?" "Actually," Harold said, and I caught the slight smile playing at his lips, "let me take care of this one. I want everything to be perfect." Perfect? For what? I wondered, but I nodded and smiled like the obedient wife he thought he'd married. While Harold planned his grand finale, I was orchestrating something far more devastating. Laura had filed my divorce papers that morning, but they wouldn't be served until after the wedding. I didn't want anything to spoil Marcus's day or tip off Harold before he'd fully committed to his public humiliation. The manila envelope became my constant companion. I carried it everywhere, sometimes touching it through my purse just to remind myself that I held all the power. Inside were copies of the divorce papers, the adultery evidence, the bank statements showing his theft, and a detailed accounting of every asset he thought he'd protected with that prenuptial agreement. 3 days before the wedding, Harold made his final, fatal mistake. "Evelyn," he said over dinner, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate, "I need to tell you something about the reception." I looked up from my plate, channeling every ounce of innocent curiosity I could muster. "What about it?" "I've invited Vanessa," he said, watching my face carefully. "She's been such a huge help with the business, and I thought it would be nice to include her in the celebration." The audacity of it took my breath away. He was bringing his mistress to our son's wedding, setting the stage for maximum cruelty, and he wanted my permission first. The old Evelyn would have questioned it, maybe even objected. But the new Evelyn, the one who'd been planning her revenge for weeks, simply smiled. "Of course," I said. "That's very thoughtful. She's been working so hard." Harold's face showed a flicker of surprise, as if he expected more resistance, but then his expression settled into smug satisfaction. He thought he'd broken me down so completely that I wouldn't even fight for my own dignity. "Good," he said. "I knew you'd understand." That night, I finalized every detail of my plan.
The envelope was prepared, the legal papers filed and ready, the evidence organized and documented. I even practiced my response in the mirror, perfecting the calm, graceful demeanor that would throw everyone off balance. Because I'd realized something crucial about revenge. The sweetest kind comes not from losing your temper, but from maintaining perfect control while your enemy destroys himself. The morning of Marcus's wedding, I woke up feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. I put on my emerald green dress, the one that made me feel confident and powerful, and did my makeup with extra care. Today wasn't just my son's wedding day. It was the day I reclaimed my life. Harold was unusually cheerful as we got ready, humming while he shaved, taking extra time with his appearance. He thought today was his victory lap, the day he'd finally rid himself of the boring wife who'd served her purpose and could now be discarded for a newer model. At the reception, I watched him whisper something to Vanessa that made her laugh, probably discussing how easy this was going to be, how I'd never see it coming. I smiled and waved at them across the room, playing my part. Until the very last moment, when Harold stood up to make his announcement, when he looked at me with that mixture of pity and cruelty in his eyes, when he delivered his rehearsed speech about our marriage being over, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He thought he was about to destroy me. Instead, he just walked directly into the trap I'd spent 6 weeks preparing. Every word he spoke, every cruel revelation, every moment of public humiliation he inflicted on me in front of our family only made the contents of that envelope more devastating. Because while Harold had been planning a public execution, I'd been preparing a resurrection that would leave him screaming.
When he opened that envelope, his whole world collapsed in real time, and I got to watch every beautiful second of it unfold. I was halfway to the parking lot when I heard the sound, a roar of pure rage and panic that cut through the evening air like a wounded animal. Through the reception hall's windows, I could see Harold standing at our table, the manila envelope torn open in his hands, papers scattered across the white tablecloth like fallen leaves. His face had drained of every drop of color. The confident, smug expression he'd worn during his announcement was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before. Genuine terror. His hands shook as he rifled through the documents, his eyes scanning the legal papers with growing horror. Vanessa leaned forward, trying to read over his shoulder, her perfectly manicured fingers reaching for the divorce papers. "Harold, what is this?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the reception hall. But Harold couldn't speak. He was staring at the bank statements I'd included, the ones showing every penny he'd stolen from our joint accounts, every dollar he'd transferred to their secret account, every purchase he'd made for her with money that belonged to both of us. "Harold?" Vanessa's voice was sharper now, more demanding. She grabbed one of the papers from his trembling hands and began to read. I watched through the window as her expression changed from confusion to disbelief to cold, calculating panic. She was reading the adultery clause in our prenuptial agreement, the clause that voided all of Harold's financial protections the moment he committed adultery, the clause that meant everything he thought he'd safeguarded for their future together was now mine to claim. "This cannot be real," Vanessa said, her voice loud enough that the nearest tables could hear every word. "You said she would never fight back. You said she was too weak, too dependent." "Too weak? Too dependent?" The words confirmed everything I'd suspected about their conversations. They'd sat in that secret apartment I helped pay for, mocking me, planning my humiliation, convinced that I was too broken down to defend myself. Harold finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper that gradually built to a shout. "She knew," he said. "She knew everything. She's been planning this." The family members at nearby tables were starting to understand that something terrible was happening. Marcus stood up from the head table, his face confused and concerned. "Dad, what's going on?" But Harold was beyond caring about appearances now. He held up the divorce papers, his voice cracking with desperation. She filed for divorce this morning. She's claiming adultery. She's trying to take everything. Take everything. Vanessa's voice was rising to match his. What do you mean, take everything? You said the prenup protected your assets. The prenup is void. Harold screamed loud enough that the entire reception hall fell silent. The adultery clause voids the whole thing. She gets the house, the investments, everything. I watched Vanessa's face cycle through a series of emotions: shock, anger, and then something that looked disturbingly like calculation. She wasn't devastated that their affair had been exposed. She was furious that the money was gone. You told me she was filing taxes. You said she was too stupid to understand finances. You said she'd never figure out the account. The account? Their secret account. She was talking about it, right there, in front of everyone, confirming every suspicion our family had ever had about their relationship. Marcus was on his feet now, his new wife Lisa beside him, both of them staring at Harold with growing horror. My sister Helen had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Lisa's parents looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor, but Harold and Vanessa were too caught up in their panic to care about the audience they'd created. They were turning on each other like cornered animals, each trying to blame the other for their predicament. You said you had everything under control, Vanessa shouted. You said she was broken, that she'd never fight back. I thought she was, Harold shot back. She never questioned anything. She never even looked at the statements. Well, clearly she looked. Vanessa's voice was pure venom now. And now what? Now we have nothing. The apartment lease is in my name. The credit cards are maxed out. You said you were going to take care of everything. The ugly truth was spilling out in front of 40 witnesses.
They weren't star-crossed lovers torn apart by circumstances. They were two greedy people who'd planned to steal my life and got caught. She froze the accounts, Harold said, reading more of the legal papers. Everything's frozen pending the divorce proceedings. We cannot access anything. Vanessa stood up so fast, her chair toppled backward. Cannot access anything? What about the apartment? What about my car payment? What about... She stopped mid-sentence, the full reality hitting her at once. Without access to Harold's money, my money that he'd been stealing, she had nothing. Her lifestyle, her security, her future with him, all of it depended on funds that no longer existed. The look she gave Harold in that moment was pure hatred. You destroyed everything, she said, her voice cold as winter. You absolute fool! And then she walked out, just like that. No goodbye, no attempt to work through the crisis together, no declaration of love that would survive financial hardship. She grabbed her purse and left Harold standing there alone with the wreckage of his choices. The silence that followed was deafening. 40 people stared at my husband as he stood among the scattered papers of his destruction, finally understanding that the quiet, dependable wife he'd underestimated had just checkmated him with his own moves. Marcus's voice cut through the silence, quiet, but carrying clearly across the room. Dad, how could you do this to Mom? But Harold had no answer. He was still staring at the legal papers, still trying to process that the woman he dismissed as weak and stupid had just destroyed him so completely that even his mistress had abandoned him. That's when he started screaming my name. Evelyn! Evelyn! Harold's voice cracked as he shouted my name across the parking lot. Get back here! We need to talk! I stopped walking and turned around slowly, taking my time. Through the reception hall's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the chaos inside. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, family members huddled in shocked conversations, and my husband standing in the middle of it all like a man whose house was burning down around him. When I walked back through those doors, the entire room fell silent. 40 pairs of eyes followed my movements as I made my way calmly to our table, where Harold stood surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. You wanted to talk? I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. Let us talk.
Harold's face was red and blotchy, his perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. The confident man who'd made his announcement 20 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone desperate and panicked. "You cannot do this," he said, his voice shaking. "Not like this. Not in front of everyone." I looked around the room at our family and friends, people who'd known us for decades, who'd celebrated our anniversary parties and holiday dinners, who'd believed we had a solid, loving marriage. "You chose the venue," I said simply. "I thought you wanted everyone to witness your big announcement." Marcus approached our table, his face pale but determined. "Mom, what's going on? Dad's saying you filed for divorce?" I nodded, reaching into my purse for the folder I prepared for this moment. "I filed this morning, honey. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but your father made that choice when he decided to destroy our marriage at your wedding dinner." "This is insane," Harold said, grabbing my arm. "You're being vindictive. You're trying to ruin me over some midlife crisis." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. "Remove your hand," I said quietly. "Now." Something in my tone made him let go immediately. Midlife crisis? I opened my folder and pulled out the bank statements. "Is that what you call stealing $40,000 from my retirement account to fund your affair?" A gasp rippled through the room. My sister Helen stepped closer, her eyes wide as she looked at the papers in my hands. "You've been tracking our accounts?" Harold's voice was getting higher, more desperate. "That's invasion of privacy. That's my job," I interrupted. "I work at a bank, remember? Tracking financial irregularities is literally what I do for a living." Laura Bennett chose that moment to walk through the reception hall doors. I'd asked her to come, knowing I might need legal backup for this conversation. "Mrs. Thompson," Laura said, approaching our table with professional calm. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Perfect timing," I said. "Laura, this is my husband, Harold. Harold, this is Laura Bennett, my attorney." The color drained from Harold's face again. "Attorney? You hired an attorney without telling me?" "The same way you open secret bank accounts without telling me," I replied. "Laura, would you mind explaining to my husband what happens when someone violates the adultery clause in their prenup?" Laura smiled, not warmly, but with professional satisfaction. "Certainly, Mr. Thompson. When you signed your prenup 32 years ago, you included a faithfulness provision that voids most asset protections in the event of adultery. Your wife has documented evidence of your affair, including financial records showing you used marital assets to support another woman." "That cannot be legal," Harold said, but his voice had lost all its fight. "It's completely legal," Laura continued. "In fact, it's exactly what you designed it to be. The prenup was your idea, your language, your protection. You just never imagined it would be used against you." Marcus was reading over the bank statements now, his expression growing darker with each line. "Dad, you stole from Mom's retirement account? You used her money to pay for your affair?" "It's not theft," Harold said weakly. "It's marital property. You had every right to use our joint funds to buy jewelry for another woman. I asked to pay for weekend trips I knew nothing about, to put a down payment on an apartment for your secretary." The room was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. Uncle Robert was shaking his head in disgust. Lisa's parents looked mortified to be witnessing this family implosion. "Where's Vanessa now?" I asked, looking around the room. "Your partner in this grand romance? The woman who was going to make you so much happier than I ever could?" Harold's silence was answer enough. "She left," Marcus said quietly.
The minute she realized the money was gone, she walked out. I nodded. That tells you everything you need to know about what your relationship was really built on. "Evelyn, please," Harold said, and for the first time his voice held genuine desperation rather than anger. "We can work this out. We can go to counseling. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." I looked at this man I'd been married to for 32 years. The stranger who'd systematically betrayed and stolen from me while I slept beside him every night and felt nothing but cold certainty. "You're right about one thing," I said. "You did make a mistake.
You assumed I was too weak, too stupid, and too dependent to fight back. You assumed wrong. I gathered my papers and put them back in my folder. The accounts are frozen until the divorce is finalized. You'll be hearing from my attorney about the asset division and the theft charges we're considering filing. As I turned to leave, Harold made one last desperate attempt. You cannot take everything. I built that business. I earned that money. I stopped and looked back at him one final time. With my credit, my unpaid labor, and my financial support, I said. And now you're going to learn exactly what that was worth. Walking out of that reception hall for the second time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete and total control over my own life. Behind me, I could hear Harold still trying to explain himself to our son, still trying to minimize what he'd done, still trying to play the victim. But nobody was listening anymore. 6 months later, on what would have been our 33rd anniversary, I was standing in the kitchen of my new bakery, Evelyn's New Beginnings, preparing my grandmother's famous lemon bars for a client's golden anniversary party. The irony wasn't lost on me. Celebrating 50 years of genuine love while my own marriage had crumbled after 32 years of lies. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, and the results were even better than Laura had predicted. The adultery clause in Harold's precious prenup had worked exactly as written, voiding every protection he thought he'd secured. I kept the house, 75% of our investments, the retirement accounts he'd tried to steal from, and received spousal support for the next 5 years. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was watching the dominoes of his carefully constructed deception fall one by one. Vanessa had lasted exactly 2 weeks after the wedding disaster. Once she realized that Harold's money was gone and wouldn't be coming back, she cleaned out their secret apartment and moved in with another man before the month ended. Word through mutual acquaintances was that her new boyfriend was a surgeon with a much larger bank account and no inconvenient wives to complicate things. Harold had tried to fight the divorce at first, hiring an expensive attorney who'd taken one look at the prenup and advised him to settle quickly. The bank statements showing systematic theft, the photographs of him with Vanessa, and the paper trail of lies had made his case impossible to defend. The business he'd been so proud of was struggling now. Without my unpaid bookkeeping and financial management, and with his reputation in tatters after word spread about the affair and the theft, clients had started looking elsewhere for their consulting needs.
He'd been forced to sell his share to his business partner just to pay his legal fees. The potential fraud charges Laura had mentioned never materialized. I decided that destroying his life was enough without sending him to prison. Sometimes mercy looks like letting someone face the natural consequences of their choices without adding extra punishment. Marcus had struggled with the revelation about his father, but he'd made his position clear the week after the wedding. "Mom," he said, sitting in my kitchen while I made him his favorite oatmeal cookies, "I'm sorry I didn't see what he was doing to you. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to stand up for you. You were not supposed to protect me," I told him. "That was never your job." My son had inherited my sense of justice and his father's stubborn streak, but he directed it in the right direction. He'd cut contact with Harold entirely after learning about the stolen retirement money, saying he couldn't respect a man who'd steal from his own wife. Lisa, my new daughter-in-law, had become one of my closest allies. She had helped me design a logo for my bakery and had been my first official client, hiring me to cater her law firm's holiday party. Word of mouth from that event had led to 3 more bookings, then 5, then 10. The bakery was everything I dreamed it would be 30 years ago and more. I specialized in gourmet desserts with elegant presentation, the kind of baking that made people feel loved and celebrated. My lemon bars had become legendary among my clients. My apple pie was booked solid through the spring. I'd even started offering baking classes on weekends for people who wanted to learn my techniques. But the best part wasn't the success or the money or even the satisfaction of building something with my own hands. The best part was waking up every morning knowing that every choice I made was mine. Every dollar I earned was mine. And every dream I pursued belonged to me alone. I'd learned something profound about myself in those months of planning my revenge. Patience and intelligence will always defeat impulse and emotion. Harold had acted from greed and selfishness, making decisions based on what he wanted in the moment. I'd acted from strategy and self-respect, building a plan that would protect my future rather than just satisfy my anger. The difference between us was that he'd seen our marriage as something to escape from, while I'd seen it as something worth fighting for until the moment he proved it wasn't worth saving. 3 weeks ago, I'd received a phone call from Harold. He was living in a studio apartment across town, working for someone else's consulting agency, and apparently feeling sorry for himself. "Evelyn," he'd said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, "I made terrible mistakes. I know I cannot undo what I did, but maybe we could talk. Maybe there's some way to fix this." I'd listened to his entire speech, his apologies, his excuses, his promises that he'd changed. When he finished, I'd said only one thing. "I hope you find happiness, Harold, but you will not find it with me." That was the last conversation we'd ever had. Now, putting the finishing touches on my client's anniversary dessert, I reflected on how much my life had changed. I owned a successful business, lived in a beautiful home that was entirely mine, and woke up every day excited about the possibilities ahead of me. I had my son's love and respect, genuine friendships with people who valued me for who I was, and dreams that belonged to nobody but me. If you're watching this and feel betrayed by someone you trusted, remember this. Sometimes the best revenge is not getting even, it's getting free. Sometimes the greatest victory is not destroying your enemy, but building a life so beautiful that their betrayal becomes the catalyst for your greatest happiness. Use their own weapons against them if you must, but do not let their choices define your future. The person who betrayed you showed you exactly who they are. Believe them, learn from it, and then build something better without them. I never could have imagined that the worst day of my marriage would become the first day of my real life. But that's exactly what happened when my husband announced our ending at our son's wedding dinner, and I handed him an envelope that changed everything. Sometimes justice tastes like lemon bars, smells like your own kitchen, and sounds like your own laughter echoing through a home that finally belongs to you. Did you like my story? And what city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments.